a mother of 4 calls 911 in the middle of the night. Her words: "I've shot my kids, and I'm going to end my life." What led to this chilling crime? What drove a Wyoming mother to commit such an unthinkable act? This is the tragic case of Tranielle Harshman and her 4 daughters, one of the most heartbreaking crimes in recent history. Let's dive into the full story. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more real-life stories that make you think. Hit that notification bell so you never miss an update. The town of Byron, Wyoming is a small, peaceful community where crime is rare. Families know each other, and neighbors often leave their doors unlocked. But on the night of February 10th, 2025, a chilling crime unfolded that would shake this quiet town to its core. 32-year-old Tranielle Harshman, a mother of 4, did something unimaginable. She shot her own daughters before turning the gun on herself. Byron, Wyoming was a small town where everyone knew each other. It was the kind of place where neighbors smiled and waved as they passed by, and children played outside without worry. The streets were lined with small houses, each with a front yard where families gathered in the evenings. The town had a few stores, a little school, and a church where people met on Sundays. Life in Byron was quiet and peaceful. People trusted one another, and doors were often left unlocked because crime was so rare. The police mostly helped with small things like lost pets or checking on elderly neighbors. Nothing bad ever seemed to happen in Byron. In this quiet town lived Tranielle Harshman and her 4 daughters. Tranielle was a young mother who loved her children very much. She lived in a small, cozy house with a white fence around the yard. Inside, the home was filled with the laughter of little girls. Her oldest daughter, Braylee, was 9 years old and loved to draw pictures. She would spend hours coloring and making cards for her mom and sisters. Olivia, who was 7, was full of energy. She loved to dance and twirl around the living room, making everyone laugh. Then there were the twins, Brooke and Jordan, who were only 2 years old. They were still learning how to talk and would giggle as they ran around the house, trying to keep up with their big sisters. Every morning in the Harshman house was busy but full of love. Tranielle would wake up early and make breakfast for her daughters. She would pour cereal into bowls, cut up fruit, and make sure everyone had what they needed before the day started. Braylee and Olivia would get ready for school, putting on their backpacks and waiting by the door. The twins would sit in their high chairs, eating little pieces of toast while watching their sisters. Tranielle would give each of them a kiss before sending the older girls off to school. During the day, the house would be quieter, with only the twins at home. Tranielle would play with them, reading stories and singing songs. She would pick up toys, do the laundry, and try to keep the house clean. But even with all the work, she loved spending time with her daughters. In the afternoons, Braylee and Olivia would come home from school, excited to tell their mom about their day. They would do their homework at the kitchen table while Tranielle made dinner. The house smelled of warm food, and the sound of children's voices filled the air. In the evenings, after dinner, the family had their favorite time of the day. The girls would play in the living room, making up games and laughing together. Sometimes they would go outside to run around the yard while the sun set behind the hills. The sky would turn pink and orange, and the cool air made everything feel peaceful. Tranielle would sit on the porch, watching her daughters play, smiling as she listened to their laughter. At bedtime, Tranielle would tuck each of them in, wrapping them in warm blankets. She would read a bedtime story, and the twins would snuggle up close, their little eyes blinking sleepily. Braylee and Olivia would whisper to each other about what they wanted to do the next day. Then, one by one, they would drift off to sleep, safe and loved in their little home. Byron was a town where people felt safe, where children could be children without fear. It was a place filled with warmth and kindness, a place where families built their lives together. The Harshman family was like any other family in town, full of love, laughter, and dreams for the future. No one could have ever imagined that anything would change. But life doesn't always stay the same. And sometimes, even in the safest places, something happens that no one expects. Tranielle Harshman grew up in a small town much like Byron. As a little girl, she loved to play outside, run through fields, and ride her bike down quiet roads. She had a kind heart and always helped others. She was the type of person who would stop to help a friend who fell or give her last piece of candy to someone else. She smiled often and had big dreams for the future. She wanted to have a family of her own one day, a house full of love and laughter. As she grew older, Tranielle worked hard in school and made friends easily. She was gentle and caring, always listening when someone needed to talk. People trusted her because she was patient and never judged anyone. When she met Cliff Harshman, she felt like she had found someone who understood her. He was hardworking and kind, and they spent hours talking about their future. They dreamed about having a home, children, and a happy life together. They got married and started building that life just as they had planned. When Tranielle became a mother, everything felt magical at first. Holding her baby in her arms made her heart feel full. She loved her children more than anything in the world. But taking care of little ones was not always easy. The long nights, the constant crying, and the endless diapers left her feeling exhausted. When her twins were born, everything became even harder. She barely had time for herself. She spent her days feeding, changing, and comforting her babies while trying to take care of the older girls. Some nights, she only got a few hours of sleep. She would rock the twins in her arms, trying to get them to stop crying, her own eyes filled with tears from exhaustion. Over time, something inside her started to change. She felt tired all the time, not just in her body but in her heart. She used to love playing with her daughters, but now she found it hard to smile. The things that once made her happy felt like too much work. She stopped calling her friends and didn't want to leave the house. She felt alone. Even though her children were always around her, she knew she should feel happy, but she didn't. Instead, she felt empty, like something was missing. Some days she would sit in the kitchen and stare at the dishes in the sink, unable to find the energy to wash them. The laundry piled up, the toys were scattered everywhere, and she felt like she was drowning. She would cry in the bathroom, not wanting the kids to see her sadness. When Cliff came home from work, she wanted to tell him how she felt, but the words wouldn't come out. She was afraid he wouldn't understand. She didn't want people to think she was a bad mother. Postpartum depression is something many mothers go through, but Tranielle didn't know how to ask for help. She told herself she had to be strong. But the sadness didn't go away. It grew bigger every day, filling her thoughts, making everything feel hopeless. She felt like she was failing, even though she was doing her best. She loved her daughters, but she felt lost inside her own mind. The days blended together, and she couldn't see a way out. People around her noticed she was different. She didn't laugh as much. She didn't visit friends. Her voice was quieter, and her eyes seemed tired all the time. But no one knew just how deep her pain had become. No one knew how alone she felt, and no one knew how much she was struggling to hold on. The night of February 9th, 2025, was quiet in Byron, Wyoming. The stars twinkled in the sky, and a soft wind blew through the town. Inside the Harshman house, the children were getting ready for bed. Braylee was reading her favorite book under a warm blanket. Olivia was brushing her doll's hair, and the twins were snuggled up in their cribs, their tiny hands curled into fists. Their soft breathing filled the house, a peaceful sound that usually made Tranielle feel calm. But tonight she didn't feel calm at all. She sat at the kitchen table, staring at the clock on the wall. The hands moved so slowly, but the night felt heavy. Her heart ached, and her body felt so tired. She had spent the whole day trying to keep up with the house, folding laundry, cleaning up spilled juice, and keeping the twins from crying. But no matter how much she did, there was always more to do. It never ended. She felt trapped, like she was stuck in a storm that wouldn't stop. She ran her fingers through her hair and let out a shaky breath. Tears filled her eyes, but she wiped them away quickly. She had cried so much lately that it felt like the tears would never stop. She wanted to feel happy again like she used to. But the sadness inside her was too big, too heavy. She felt like she was carrying a weight that no one could see. The house was quiet now, but her thoughts were loud. She couldn't stop thinking. She wondered if she was a bad mother. She wondered if her children would be better off without her. She didn't want to think about these things, but the thoughts wouldn't go away. She felt lost, like she was standing in the dark with no way out. She picked up her phone and scrolled through her contacts. She needed to talk to someone, to tell someone how she felt. Her fingers trembled as she pressed a name. The phone rang, and after a few seconds, a familiar voice answered. "Tranielle, are you okay?" The voice was gentle, filled with concern. Tranielle swallowed hard. She opened her mouth to speak, but for a moment, no words came out. Then her voice broke. I can't do this anymore," she whispered. There was silence on the other end, then a worried response. "What do you mean? Talk to me. What's wrong?" She let out a shaky breath. "I'm tired. I'm so tired. I don't know how to keep going." Her voice cracked and a sob escaped her lips. "I love my kids, but I don't think I can do this." The person on the other end tried to calm her down. "Listen to me, Tranielle. You're not alone. I know it's hard, but you can get through this. Please let me help you. Let's talk in the morning. Just hold on." Tranielle wiped her tears, but they kept coming. Her hands were shaking. She wanted to believe that things could get better, but she couldn't see how. Everything felt too big, too heavy. She squeezed her eyes shut. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I don't say that. You don't have to be sorry. You just need help. Let me come over. Let's figure this out together," the voice pleaded. But Tranielle shook her head, even though the person couldn't see her. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "I have to go." "No, wait," the voice tried to stop her, but she had already ended the call. She placed the phone on the table and stared at it. The room felt too quiet now. The only sound was the soft ticking of the clock. Each second felt heavier than the last. She looked toward the hallway where her children were sleeping, their tiny bodies curled up under warm blankets. The night outside was still peaceful. The stars still shined. But inside the house, something felt different. The air was thick with sadness, and an uneasy silence filled the space. Tranielle sat there for a long time, lost in her thoughts, her face wet with tears. The night wasn't over yet, but something deep inside her felt like it was. The house was dark and silent in the early hours of February 10th, 2025. The only sound was the soft ticking of the clock on the wall. Tranielle sat alone in the dim light, staring at nothing. Her eyes were red from crying and her hands trembled in her lap. She felt cold, even though the house was warm. Her thoughts swirled in her head, loud and heavy. She wanted to make the pain stop. She wanted the sadness to go away. But no matter how hard she tried, it wouldn't leave her. She stood up slowly, her legs weak beneath her. Each step felt heavy, like she was walking through deep water. She moved through the quiet house, past the couch where her children had played just hours ago, past the kitchen table where they had eaten dinner together. She walked down the hall, stopping at the doorway of their rooms. She looked inside, her heart pounding in her chest. Braylee was curled up under her blanket, her little hand tucked under her cheek. Olivia's doll rested beside her on the bed. The twins slept peacefully, their tiny bodies rising and falling with each breath. They looked so safe, so unaware of the storm inside their mother's heart. Tranielle wiped a tear from her face. She loved them. She loved them more than anything. But she felt lost, like she had fallen into a deep hole with no way out. She believed they would be better off without her, even though it wasn't true. Her hands shook as she reached for the gun. It felt heavy, cold. Her breath was shaky as she held it, her fingers gripping it tightly. Her heart pounded louder, and her chest felt tight. She told herself this was the only way. The only way to make the pain stop. The only way to finally rest. She took one last deep breath, then lifted the gun. A loud bang shattered the silence, then another, and another. The house, once peaceful, was now filled with something dark and terrible. Minutes later, Tranielle picked up the phone with unsteady hands and dialed 911. When the call connected, her voice was weak and broken. I've shot my kids," she whispered. Her words barely came out, her breath shaking. The dispatcher's voice was calm but urgent. "Ma'am, I need you to stay on the line with me. Are your children breathing?" Silence. Tranielle's lips trembled. She wiped her wet face with her sleeve. "Tranielle, stay with me," the dispatcher said, trying to keep her talking. "Help is on the way." "I can't do this anymore," Tranielle murmured. "I'm sorry." "Tranielle, listen to me. You don't have to do this. Stay with me, okay? Just breathe." But the line went dead. The dispatcher quickly sent police officers to the house. Sirens screamed through the night, flashing lights cutting through the darkness. The town was asleep, unaware of the horror that had just unfolded. When the police arrived, they knocked on the door, but there was no answer. Everything was quiet. Too quiet. The officers exchanged worried glances before stepping back and breaking down the door. Inside, the house was still. The air felt heavy, like a storm had just passed through. The officers moved carefully, their eyes scanning the rooms. And then they saw it. The beds, the small bodies. The silence. Their hearts pounded as they checked each child, their hands shaking. 3 were gone, but 1 was still breathing. "Call for medics now," one officer shouted, his voice urgent. They moved quickly, scooping Olivia into their arms, rushing her outside to the waiting ambulance. Then, in the next room, they found Tranielle. She lay motionless, the gun nearby. The sorrow in the room was suffocating. The officers stood in stunned silence, their minds struggling to make sense of what they had just walked into. The house that had once been filled with laughter and love was now filled with something no one in Byron had ever seen before. And the night, once quiet and peaceful, would never be the same again. The room was still and quiet, but Olivia's small body still held on to life. Her breath was faint, barely there, but it was enough for the officer who found her to shout for help. His voice was sharp and urgent, calling for the paramedics to hurry. They rushed inside, their boots pounding against the floor, as they moved quickly toward the little girl. One paramedic gently touched her neck, feeling for a pulse. It was weak, but it was there. "She's alive," he said, his voice filled with both hope and fear. They worked fast, placing an oxygen mask over her tiny face, lifting her carefully onto a stretcher. One paramedic whispered words of encouragement, though Olivia couldn't hear him. "Stay with us, sweetheart. You're strong." The ambulance doors slammed shut, and the sirens wailed as they sped toward the hospital. Inside, the paramedics fought to keep her breathing, checking her pulse, giving her medicine, watching every little movement she made. They knew she had very little time. At the hospital, doctors and nurses stood ready. As soon as the ambulance arrived, they rushed her inside. Bright lights, loud voices, fast-moving hands, everything was a blur of action. Olivia was placed on a bed and doctors surrounded her. They worked quickly, calling out instructions, attaching tubes and wires, trying everything to save her. Machines beeped, monitors flashed, and the doctors did everything they could to keep her heart beating. Meanwhile, her father, Quinn Blackmer, got the phone call no parent ever wants to receive. His hands shook as he held the phone to his ear, listening to the words that shattered his world. His little girl had been hurt. She was fighting for her life. He barely heard the rest of the conversation. His heart pounded as he grabbed his keys and rushed to the hospital. His wife, Katilin, followed, her face pale with shock. Neither of them spoke on the drive. There were no words for something like this. When they arrived, they ran inside, searching for answers. "Where is Olivia? Is she okay?" Quinn's voice was desperate, his hands gripping the front desk as he begged for news. A nurse led them to the waiting area, her face kind but serious. "The doctors are doing everything they can," she said. "Please wait here." The minutes felt like hours. The waiting room was too quiet, too cold. Quinn sat with his head in his hands, his whole body shaking. Caitlin held onto him, trying to stay strong, but her own tears wouldn't stop. Every time the doors to the emergency room swung open, they held their breath, hoping for good news, but no one came to tell them anything. Inside the operating room, the doctors continued to fight for Olivia. They worked with steady hands, their voices calm but urgent. They stopped the bleeding, adjusted the machines, and did everything they had been trained to do. But Olivia was so small, so fragile. They knew she was running out of time. Back in the waiting room, Quinn whispered prayers under his breath, even though he wasn't sure who he was praying to. He just wanted his daughter to live. Caitlin kept looking toward the doors, hoping to see a doctor walking toward them with a hopeful smile. But no one came. The silence stretched on, thick and heavy. The doctors kept working, the machines kept beeping, and Olivia kept fighting. But no one knew if it would be enough. Byron had always been a quiet town where nothing bad ever seemed to happen. But on the morning of February 10th, 2025, everything changed. The news of what happened at the Harshman house spread quickly. People whispered in shock, their voices filled with disbelief. Mothers held their children a little tighter, and fathers shook their heads, unable to understand. No one could believe that something so terrible had happened in their peaceful town. Neighbors began gathering outside the house, their faces pale and full of sorrow. Some stood silently, staring at the small home where laughter had once filled the air. Others wiped away tears, hugging each other for comfort. One by one, people started leaving flowers, candles, and stuffed animals on the front porch. A small teddy bear sat next to a pink flower, a quiet reminder of the children who had lived there. Someone lit a candle, and soon, more candles flickered in the evening light. The street was filled with people mourning, their hearts broken for the little girls who were gone. The local news covered the story first, but soon it spread beyond Byron. Reporters from other cities arrived, setting up cameras near the house. The story appeared on TV screens, in newspapers, and all over the internet. People from all over the country began talking about it. Some were heartbroken, others were angry. Many asked the same question: how could something like this happen? Mental health experts spoke on the news, explaining how postpartum depression and untreated mental illness can lead to deep suffering. They talked about how some mothers feel alone, afraid to ask for help because they worry about being judged. Doctors explained that depression is not a choice, and that people who struggle need support, not shame. They urged families to look out for each other, to notice when someone seems sad or withdrawn, and to reach out before it's too late. In schools and workplaces, people talked about the tragedy. Parents wondered if they had ever missed signs of sadness in someone they knew. Teachers spoke to their students about kindness and looking out for friends. Community leaders called for better support for struggling mothers, saying that no one should have to suffer in silence. Some people started raising money to help families dealing with mental health struggles. Others shared their own stories of depression, hoping to help those who felt alone. As the days passed, the candles outside the Harshman house continued to burn. More flowers appeared, more people stopped by, whispering prayers and leaving notes of love. The town had lost something it could never get back, but in their grief, they promised to do better. They promised to listen, to care, and to never ignore someone's pain again. The hospital room was quiet, except for the steady beeping of machines. Olivia lay still in the hospital bed, her tiny body surrounded by wires and tubes. Her father, Quinn, sat beside her, holding her small hand in his. His eyes were full of tears, but he kept his voice soft and gentle. "You are so strong, Olivia," he whispered. "Daddy loves you so much." Caitlin stood on the other side, brushing Olivia's hair away from her face. "We're right here, sweetheart," she said, her voice shaking. "You don't have to be afraid." The doctors had done everything they could, but Olivia's little body had been through too much. The machines beeped slower, and the nurses stood nearby, watching with sadness in their eyes. Quinn squeezed Olivia's hand, hoping for a miracle, hoping for her eyes to open. But then the beeping stopped. The doctor stepped forward and placed a hand on Quinn's shoulder. "She's gone," he said softly. Quinn felt his heart break into a million pieces. His little girl, the one who had fought so hard, was now gone. He buried his face in his hands, his body shaking with grief. Caitlin sobbed quietly, holding Olivia's hand for just a little longer. The nurses turned off the machines and the room fell into silence. Outside, the world kept moving, but for Olivia's family, everything had stopped. A few days later, the funeral was held for Olivia and her 3 sisters. The church was filled with people, their faces full of sorrow. 4 small white caskets stood at the front, covered in flowers and soft pink ribbons. A picture of each girl sat on top, showing their bright smiles frozen in time. One by one, family members and friends stood up to speak. Quinn's voice was heavy with emotion as he talked about his daughters. "They were my whole world," he said. "Braylee was the artist, always drawing pictures for me. Olivia loved to dance and make people laugh. Brooke and Jordan were just starting to say new words, just learning the world around them." His voice broke and he wiped his eyes. "I don't know how to say goodbye." Others spoke about the girls, sharing memories of their kindness, their laughter, and their bright spirits. A teacher from the school said Braylee and Olivia were always helping their classmates. They had the biggest hearts. A neighbor added, "They were full of love, always smiling, always playing outside together." Outside the church, people stood quietly, holding hands, wiping their tears. The community had come together to honor the girls, just as they had when the tragedy first happened. Balloons were released into the sky, floating higher and higher, disappearing into the clouds. Candles flickered in the soft breeze, placed in a row along the church steps. Someone whispered, "They will never be forgotten." As the sun began to set, Quinn and Caitlin stood by the graves, watching as the caskets were lowered into the ground. "Goodbye, my sweet girls," Quinn whispered. The pain was heavy, but as he looked around, he saw the love that surrounded them. People had come from all over to show they cared. Though the sorrow was deep, so was the love. The 4 sisters were gone, but they would always be in the hearts of those who loved them. This tragedy was more than just a sad story, it was a reminder of something very important. Sometimes people who seem fine on the outside are struggling deep inside. Tranielle loved her children, but she was hurting in a way no one could see. She was not a bad person. She was a mother who needed help but didn't know how to ask for it. When people go through something as painful as postpartum depression, their minds can trick them into thinking they are alone, even when they are not. Postpartum depression is an illness that some mothers get after having a baby. It makes them feel very sad, tired, and even hopeless. It can make simple things feel impossible, like getting out of bed or taking care of their family. Some mothers feel like they are not good enough, even though they love their children with all their hearts. If they don't get help, the sadness can grow bigger and bigger until they feel like they have no way out. That is why it is so important for people to check on their loved ones. Sometimes just asking someone if they are okay can make a big difference. If a mother seems very tired or sad all the time, she might need someone to talk to. It is not always easy to see when someone is struggling, but a kind word, a hug, or even just listening can help them feel less alone. No one should have to go through hard times by themselves. Mothers should also know that it is okay to ask for help. They do not have to do everything alone. It is not a weakness to say, "I need support." In fact, asking for help is one of the bravest things a person can do. Family members, friends, and doctors are there to help. There are also special places where people can talk to someone who understands what they are going through. Communities need to make sure that mental health is taken seriously. Just like people go to the doctor when they are sick, they should be able to get help when they are feeling sad or overwhelmed. Schools, workplaces, and churches should talk about mental health more, so no one feels ashamed for needing help. No one should ever feel like they have to suffer in silence. Even though this tragedy was heartbreaking, it can teach the world something important. It can remind people to be kinder, to pay attention to those who might be struggling, and to make sure no one feels alone. If someone is feeling sad or hopeless, there is always a way to get help. There are doctors, counselors, and loved ones who care. There is always hope, and there is always another day to try again. No one should ever feel like they are alone in their pain. There is help, and there is love. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. What do you think about this story? What lessons can we learn from it? Your voice matters, and we read every single comment. Support this channel by sharing this video with a friend who might find it meaningful. Every share helps more people become aware of these important issues, and don't forget to subscribe, like, and hit the notification bell so you never miss an update.